In the spring of 1967, Moscow was a city built on suspicion. Foreign diplomats were followed from the moment they left their residences. Hotel rooms were assumed to be compromised. Phones were tapped, letters intercepted, and chance encounters carefully orchestrated by the Committee for State Security, the KGB. By the mid-1960s, Soviet counterintelligence had become one of the most sophisticated internal security systems in the world. And yet, even the most paranoid systems develop blind spots. This story begins not in Moscow, but in Langley, Virginia, where analysts inside the Central Intelligence Agency were confronting a growing problem. The CIA had technical collection platforms, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and a web of informants across Eastern Europe. But when it came to the inner thinking of Soviet leadership, the moods, disagreements, fears, and informal conversations that shaped decisions, the agency was largely blind. Hard intelligence existed. Human insight did not. Meetings of the Soviet elite were guarded, scripted, and filtered. Official documents revealed policy, but not intention. Public statements revealed posture, not doubt. What American intelligence lacked was proximity, not access to files, but access to people when they were unguarded. The CIA's Moscow station knew this better than anyone. By the mid-1960s, traditional espionage methods inside the Soviet capital were yielding diminishing returns. Diplomatic cover was increasingly compromised. Recruitment was dangerous and rare. Surveillance was constant. Something different was needed. The idea did not come from a strategist or a senior officer. It came from a defector. In 1964, a former KGB surveillance specialist defected to the West during an assignment in Eastern Europe. During debriefings, he described in meticulous detail how Soviet counterintelligence operated, what it feared, what it prioritized, and what it ignored. Among his observations was a curious detail. Soviet leadership assumed their private residences were secure, not because they were careless, but because they believed penetration was impossible. Domestic staff were vetted for political reliability. Homes were located in control neighborhoods. Guards monitored the perimeter. But inside those homes, especially in informal spaces, gardens, terraces, kitchens, officials often relaxed. They spoke freely, not about secrets in a formal sense, but about concerns, frustrations, rivalries, and intentions. About operations they believed were invisible. About failures they would never admit publicly. About doubts that never appeared in reports. The defector described it as a cultural assumption that class hierarchy itself was a form of security. Workers were present, but unseen. To the CIA, this was not a vulnerability, it was an opportunity. But exploiting it would require an extraordinary kind of operative. Not a spy who collected documents. Not someone who recruited assets or ran operations. But someone who could exist quietly, convincingly, and indefinitely at the margins of power. Someone who could disappear in plain sight. In 1965, a small internal task group began exploring the concept of long-term passive human intelligence collection through non-traditional cover. The goal was not infiltration of institutions, but immersion in environments where senior officials let their guard down. The constraints were severe. The operative would have to live under deep cover for years, possibly decades. There would be no regular contact with handlers, no extraction timeline, no operational heroics, just patience, discipline, and endurance. Few candidates were even considered. One of them was a 34-year-old CIA officer raised on a farm in rural Oregon. For the purposes of this account, he will be referred to as Thomas Whitmore, a pseudonym used to protect identities that remain classified. Whitmore was not a stereotypical intelligence officer. He had no flair for social engineering, no appetite for risk-taking. What he possessed instead was something rarer: emotional control. Psychological assessments described him as methodical, unreactive, and unusually comfortable with solitude. He had spent several years under non-official cover in Eastern Europe, spoke fluent Russian with a regional accent that did not draw attention, and, crucially, had genuine, practical skills that could not be faked. He knew agriculture. He knew soil, seasons, tools, and labor. in a system that distrusted intellect but relied on competence that mattered. Whitmore was briefed on the concept in late 1965. There was no formal operation name yet, only a question. Would he consider disappearing into a life that was not his own, with no guarantee of return? The briefing was blunt. He would not be a hero. He would not steal documents or plant bugs. He would not be told what his intelligence was worth or how it was used. His job would be to listen, observe, and remember. To live as someone else, so completely that the person he had been would slowly fade. If compromised, the United States would deny knowing him. If he broke psychologically, there would be no rescue. Whitmore asked for time. He was given weeks. When he accepted, the agency began preparations that would last nearly 2 years. He was sent to a secure facility in rural Pennsylvania, where former Soviet citizens, defectors, and linguists helped build an environment that mirrored Soviet daily life. Not an idealized version, but the banal reality: queues, shortages, routines, and social rules. He learned how Soviet workers complained without crossing political lines, how they showed deference without servility, how they avoided attention not by hiding, but by being predictable. Most importantly, he learned how to think as someone with limited agency. His cover identity was designed to withstand scrutiny precisely because it was unremarkable. A widower from the western regions of the Soviet Union. Limited education. No military service. No ambition beyond steady work. A man whose past contained loss, but no mysteries. The documents are real, not forged in the traditional sense, but acquired through long-standing intelligence channels that had learned how to insert identities into Soviet bureaucratic systems without raising alarms. By early 1967, the preparation was complete. Whitmore crossed into the Soviet Union quietly, entering through a minor border point where inspections were routine but not theatrical. There was no dramatic moment, no music, no sense of destiny, just a man carrying a small suitcase, stepping into a life that would slowly erase the one he had known. For the first months, he did not spy. He worked. He took small jobs, repaired fences, cleared courtyards, helped pensioners tend tiny garden plots behind crumbling apartment blocks. He lived in a communal flat, shared kitchens, waited in lines, attended mandatory meetings. He became visible enough to be known, but invisible enough to be ignored. And somewhere in Moscow, without knowing it, senior officials were about to open a door they believed no foreign intelligence service could ever pass through. By early summer of 1967, Ivan Petrov existed, not as an alias on paper, but as a person others recognized. A man with habits, a face that appeared in courtyards, a name spoken casually by people who had no reason to remember it. This was the most dangerous phase of any deep cover operation, the moment when theory met reality. Petrov's life during those first months in Moscow followed a deliberate pattern. He worked short-term labor jobs arranged through informal networks that existed beyond official employment offices. These gray market exchanges were common in the Soviet capital, where shortages created demand for skilled hands that the state could not efficiently supply. He fixed fences, repaired sheds, pruned neglected fruit trees. He accepted payment quietly, never haggled, never rushed. Reliability mattered more than speed. Word traveled slowly but steadily. The Soviet system distrusted outsiders, but it trusted competence. A man who showed up on time, worked without complaint, and did not ask questions was valuable. By June, Petrov had been recommended several times for longer-term work. One lead, passed through a cleaner who worked for a party official's household, mentioned that a senior government residence in the southwest of Moscow had lost its regular groundskeeper to illness. The property belonged to a high-ranking security official, not a public figure, but someone with administrative authority inside the internal security apparatus. This was not an accident. CIA planners had never targeted a specific individual. That would have introduced too much risk. Instead, they had identified a category of households where access was plausible, but scrutiny was not absolute. Senior officials with private residences who relied on civilian labor rather than uniform guards for daily maintenance. The approach was indirect. Petrov's name was mentioned, not promoted. He did not present himself. He waited. 3 days later, he was summoned. The interview took place at the property itself. Petrov arrived early, dressed plainly, carrying his tools. He was met not by security officers, but by the official's wife, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the posture of someone accustomed to authority. She did not ask him about politics. She asked him about apple trees. The estate had several aging trees that had stopped producing fruit. Petrov examined the bark, the leaves, the soil. He explained calmly what had gone wrong. Poor pruning, compacted roots, insufficient winter protection. He did not flatter. He did not exaggerate his expertise. He spoke as a laborer would, precise but practical. This mattered more than ideology. At no point did he claim loyalty or enthusiasm. He did not volunteer opinions. When asked about his background, he answered plainly. A collective farm. A wife who had died young. Work wherever it was available. Nothing exceptional. Nothing memorable. 3 days later, he was offered the position. The vetting process began immediately. Contrary to popular myth, it was not theatrical. There were no interrogations under bright lights. Instead, there was paperwork, routine checks, quiet verification. His documents were authentic Soviet papers, issued years earlier, tied into real registries. His Moscow residence existed. His work history existed, because it had been built deliberately, piece by piece. Security officers interviewed him once, then again weeks later. The questions were repetitive by design. Family, work habits, political views expressed in safe, unremarkable terms. Petrov answered consistently because there was nothing to invent. What the vetting focused on was not espionage. It focused on loyalty. Was he resentful? Ambitious? Curious? Did he drink excessively? Did he complain too freely? Did he ask questions beyond his station? He did none of these things. By late July 1967, Ivan Petrov moved into a small outbuilding on the property. It was not luxury. A narrow bed, a table, a stove, but it was private, and privacy was essential. The estate itself was substantial, but not extravagant by elite standards. A large pre-revolutionary house, renovated unevenly over decades, surrounded by gardens that had been allowed to decay. The official who lived there, here referred to as Colonel Dmitry Volkov, another pseudonym, was frequently absent. His work kept him at headquarters long hours, sometimes for days. His wife oversaw the household. There were other staff, a cook and a housekeeper who arrived during the day, a driver who lived elsewhere. No one else stayed overnight on the grounds. Petrov's job was physical, visible, and constant. For the first 3 months, he did nothing but work. He restored neglected flower beds, pruned rose bushes, repaired irrigation lines, prepared soil for autumn planting. He worked through rain, heat, and early frost, not as performance, but as survival. If the gardens improved, he stayed. If they failed, he was replaced. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. By autumn, the estate looked cared for again. The change pleased the household. That pleasure translated into something more valuable than praise. Familiarity. Petrov became part of the environment. A man seen daily, but no longer noticed. This was not accidental. Deep cover operatives are trained not to stand out, but invisibility is not passive. It is constructed through routine, predictable behavior, consistent rhythms. Petrov rose before dawn. He took breaks at the same times. He ended his work at the same hour. He spoke when spoken to. He did not linger. The household learned his patterns, and once learned, stopped registering him. This was when the operation truly began. The intelligence he gathered at first was minimal. Arrival and departure times, visitor frequency, security patrol habits, which days were quiet, which were busy. He did not write anything down. Memory came first. Only at night, alone in his room, did he quietly record observations using an agreed system that disguised intelligence as mundane agricultural notes. These reports were brief, sparse, almost boring, and that was intentional. The first rule of long-term human intelligence collection is patience. Information accumulates slowly. Patterns reveal themselves only over time. Petrov's handlers expected nothing dramatic. What they did not need to instruct him on was the most important element of the operation: restraint. He was not there to discover secrets. He was there to understand people, to hear how officials spoke when they were tired, when they were irritated, when they believed no one of consequence was listening. And slowly, without ceremony, that began to happen. Doors were left open during warm afternoons. Conversations drifted into the garden. Names were mentioned casually. Complaints were voiced without caution. Petrov did not react. He did not pause his work. He did not look up. He continued pruning, raking, planting. And he listened. This was the moment of no return. From here on, Ivan Petrov could not leave without raising questions. And Thomas Whitmore, the man he had once been, began to recede. Not dramatically, but quietly, the way habits replace intention. By the end of 1967, the CIA had received its first substantive reports from inside a Soviet elite household. They were modest, unspectacular, but they were real, and they would never stop coming. By the winter of 1967, Ivan Petrov had stopped thinking of himself as a visitor. This was not a conscious decision. It happened the way long-term roles always do, through repetition. The same gate opened each morning. The same path across frozen ground. The same sequence of tasks that turned days into months without clear boundaries between them. Snow simplified the estate. Footpaths hardened into narrow corridors of movement. Gardens disappeared beneath white, leaving only skeletal branches and the dark geometry of fences. Outdoor work slowed, but did not stop. Firewood needed splitting. Drains had to remain clear. Equipment required maintenance. Petrov remained visible, and therefore acceptable. Winter was also the season when conversations lengthened. People lingered indoors. Windows stayed shut. Voices carried. Colonel Volkov's absences grew more frequent. When he was home, he was often tired, irritated, and less guarded than usual. The political climate inside the Soviet security services had tightened after a series of internal scandals unrelated to foreign intelligence. Careers were under scrutiny. Promotions stalled. Blame moved downward. Petrov learned this not through documents, but through tone. Volkov complained to his wife about incompetence in other departments, about directives that changed without explanation, about pressure from above that no one dared challenge openly. Names surfaced repeatedly. Departments, committees. A pattern of tension between internal security units and military intelligence emerged, though Petrov did not yet understand its significance. What he understood was mood, and mood was data. By January 1968, Petrov's handlers had begun adjusting their expectations. His reports, though still cautious and limited, demonstrated something rare: access to unfiltered internal sentiment within a senior household connected to security administration. This was not classified intelligence in the traditional sense. There were no documents, no diagrams, no lists, but intelligence services value context as much as content. Understanding how officials perceive their own system can reveal more than any stolen memo. Petrov continued to submit his reports through the same slow, low-risk method. The transfer system had been established months earlier. Dead drops placed in public spaces that attracted no attention, often disguised as construction debris or discarded packaging. There were no regular schedules. Predictability invited detection. Instead, communication occurred only when there was sufficient material to justify the risk. Sometimes weeks passed without contact. This suited Petrov. The less he thought about his handlers, the easier it was to remain immersed. Yet immersion came at a cost. As winter deepened, Petrov began to experience the first signs of what intelligence psychologists later described as identity compression. The constant performance of a role, even one built from authentic elements, narrows emotional range. Responses become habitual. Curiosity fades. He spoke less, even when spoken to. This was not strategy. It was fatigue. The household staff noticed little. If anything, Petrov's quietness reinforced their perception of him as a reliable, unambitious worker. But internally, the strain accumulated. He was careful not to drink excessively, but isolation sharpened his awareness. There was no one with whom he could speak freely. No one who knew both names he carried. Winter nights were long. The outbuilding was cold despite the stove. Petrov passed evenings reading outdated agricultural manuals and repairing tools he did not need to repair. He slept poorly. Meanwhile, the intelligence environment shifted. In February 1968, Petrov overheard a conversation that marked a turning point. Colonel Volkov hosted two colleagues for dinner, both mid-level officials with administrative roles in separate security directorates. The gathering was informal. No driver remained on site. No aides accompanied them. Petrov was clearing snow from a path near the rear of the house when voices drifted through an open window. The men spoke cautiously at first, but as the evening progressed, caution softened. They discussed Prague, not in ideological terms, but operational ones. There was concern about instability in Czechoslovakia, reformist rhetoric, pressure from Moscow to prepare contingencies. The tone was not aggressive. It was anxious. One of the men expressed frustration that internal security assessments conflicted with military intelligence projections. Another suggested that decisions were being rushed without adequate local understanding. Volkov listened more than he spoke. Petrov did not understand the full implications at the time, but he recognized that this was the first discussion he had heard that connected internal debates to potential external action. This was no longer just mood. It was pre-decisional friction. That night, Petrov wrote more than usual. His report avoided speculation. He did not claim foreknowledge. He documented only what was said, who said it, and the context in which it occurred. When the CIA received the report weeks later, analysts cross-referenced it with other streams of intelligence. It did not confirm anything, but aligned. Alignment mattered. From this point on, Petrov's value increased. Subtly at first. No change in instructions. No new demands. The agency understood that pressing a long-term asset prematurely was a mistake that could not be undone. Instead, they waited. Inside the household, dynamics shifted. Volkov's wife began confiding in Petrov more frequently. Not about politics, but about frustrations with her husband's work, the unpredictability of his schedule, the stress she felt living in a world where silence was a form of protection. She spoke while Petrov worked. He responded politely but non-committally. He offered no advice. He agreed without enthusiasm. This too was data, not content but vulnerability. By early March, Volkov began bringing work home more often. Briefcases appeared. Papers were reviewed late at night. Petrov never approached them, never looked directly. Instead, he paid attention to timing, to routines disrupted, to nights when lights stayed on until dawn. He noted when Volkov seemed agitated the next morning, when his tone with the staff grew sharp, when phone calls ended abruptly. All of this fed into a growing picture of internal pressure building within the Soviet security apparatus. But with value came danger. As Petrov's awareness deepened, so did his risk. Knowing more meant carrying more. There was no safe way to forget information. The question was no longer whether he could continue. It was whether continuing would cost him something irreversible. By the end of March 1968, Petrov realized he was no longer simply observing a system. He was embedded in it, and the system was beginning to move. Spring of 1968 arrived slowly, like an unseen hand brushing frost from the edges of the estate. But in Ivan Petrov's world, warmth meant nothing. The household routines persisted with quiet efficiency, yet subtle changes hinted that a storm was approaching. Petrov noticed it first in the mail. Official correspondence intended for Colonel Volkov was becoming more frequent, arriving in bundles that had to be sorted and verified. Occasionally, envelopes were hand-delivered by couriers who lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, their eyes flicking toward the windows. Petrov did not touch the correspondence. He merely noted patterns, which envelopes arrived together, which ones were opened immediately, and which were deferred. Inside the house, the tension was palpable. Volkov moved faster, spoke less, and left for longer periods without explanation. One evening, he returned at midnight, coat damp with rain, face flushed. He ignored his staff completely, retreating to the study with a single word to his wife, "Don't disturb me." The shift in his energy was unmistakable. Petrov recognized a signal. Something significant was underway, something outside the immediate domestic sphere. By April, Petrov's handlers were pressing for more detail. "We need specifics," one message read, "not rumors or mood. Show movement." The phrasing was careful, deliberate. The request was subtle. They did not want him to take risks, but the expectation was clear. The agency now knew that Petrov could collect intelligence that was not documented, social dynamics, habits, and unguarded conversations, and that this intelligence had tangible value. The first true test came one rainy afternoon. Volkov's sister, visiting from Moscow, arrived unexpectedly. The household was bustling, servants scrambling to accommodate. Petrov was assigned to assist with luggage and refreshments. He knew instinctively that new arrivals always increase scrutiny. His movements had to be natural, unobtrusive. Any misstep could draw attention. The conversation that day was casual, almost banal, but laden with significance. Volkov's sister spoke of the capital, of changes in personnel, of new directives. Her tone was critical but cautious. She weighed every word. Petrov listened silently, noting the cadence of her speech, the subtle expressions that betrayed tension or concern. During the same period, Petrov became aware of a second type of pressure, surveillance within a household. Not external agents, not the state's typical monitoring, but the ordinary curiosity of staff. New cleaners, temporary workers, or visiting neighbors could be unwitting eyes. Petrov adjusted instinctively, minimizing time alone with critical spaces, keeping notes in his head rather than written. The work became mental chess. Anticipate observation, adapt, record without leaving traces. A week later, the agency escalated the pressure. A message arrived via dead drop, marked in a familiar cipher. It was a single instruction: observe and report on Volkov's interactions with military officers visiting the estate. This was unprecedented. For months, Petrov had been documenting casual conversations, moods, and domestic tensions. Now he was asked to step beyond, to witness and interpret potentially sensitive meetings. Petrov's anxiety was immediate. He understood that external visits carried risk. Officers could be trained in counterintelligence. A slip of the tongue, a glance perceived as intrusive, could unravel months of careful positioning. Yet the role demanded he comply. The intelligence value was enormous. First-hand insight into the coordination, or lack thereof, between Volkov's household and broader security operations. The first meeting occurred on a Tuesday. Two uniformed officers arrived in a black car, leaving footprints that the melting snow would soon obscure. Petrov was stationed in the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare tea. From this vantage, he could hear conversation in the study, but not see documents or read handwriting. He relied on voice, tone, pauses, and inflection. The conversation was formal at first, peppered with military jargon and references to operational readiness. But as the officers relaxed, likely misjudging the absence of an observer, they began discussing logistical concerns and administrative disputes. There were no state secrets uttered aloud, yet the subtleties revealed patterns. The officers' hesitations, the disagreements over procedural authority, the undercurrents of frustration towards central command. Petrov recorded everything in his mind, repeating lines silently, storing them in sequences that would later be reconstructed with precision. Hours passed. He could feel the strain settling into his shoulders. By the end, he was exhausted, but the data was invaluable. The next day, a minor but revealing incident occurred. Volkov misplaced a folder containing schedules for upcoming security drills. The staff panicked briefly. Petrov observed silently, noting how each individual responded. Panic and caution were two sides of the same coin. Understanding how household responded to stress provided indirect intelligence about operational culture. By the third week of April, Petrov had compiled a mental dossier. The officers' communication habits, Volkov's decision-making style under pressure, the staff's chain of loyalty, and even the subtle cues that indicated potential conflicts. This dossier, though intangible, formed the backbone of several future reports. But the true test arrived unexpectedly. Late one evening, a phone call came for Volkov. It was whispered, urgent, delivered in clipped tones. Volkov's wife, fearing to interrupt, gestured at Petrov to continue his chores. Petrov paused near the doorway, listening carefully. The discussion involved reassignment of personnel, potential inspection visits, and, briefly, mention of a foreign concern that could jeopardize operations. Petrov recognized instantly the significance. This was no ordinary planning call. The mention of external scrutiny implied that Moscow was monitoring or preparing to audit the estate's operations. Any mistake, even accidental, could be fatal. Petrov's heart raced, but he continued his tasks, internalizing every word, every inflection. This period, the first true exposure to high-stakes operational intelligence, changed him. Sleep became fragmented. Meals were mechanical. Every movement required evaluation. If someone entered unexpectedly, if a document shifted, if a conversation turned too close to a sensitive topic, Petrov had to decide instantly whether to retreat, observe, or fabricate casual presence. By month's end, the agency acknowledged the success of the operation. Petrov's reports, reconstructed from memory, were cross-checked against other intelligence sources. Analysts confirmed their accuracy. The subtle patterns he had noticed, command disagreements, procedural inconsistencies, stress points within Volkov's household, now informed broader strategic assessments. But recognition did not ease the personal cost. Petrov understood that long-term exposure, constant observation, and the burden of knowledge were slowly eroding him. He was no longer merely a worker. He had become a vessel for information, each memory a potential liability. In the final days of April, Petrov reflected silently. What was he now? A domestic worker? A silent observer? A pawn in a game that spanned continents? He could not answer, and perhaps that uncertainty was the very point. The system required compliance without certainty, observation without participation, endurance without recognition. May of 1968 arrived in a haze of gray skies and distant thunder. Though the storm was not in the clouds, it was an invisible current of power and suspicion that swirled through Ivan Petrov's life. The household, once orderly, now vibrated with tension. Every movement was calculated. Every glance, every gesture could carry significance. Petrov understood the rules. Observe, remember, adapt, survive. But the rules of survival were shifting. Volkov's visits to Moscow increased. He returned with faces unfamiliar to Petrov, officers with clipped accents, thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Each meeting brought new directives, new demands, and new dangers. The staff were warned to expect inspectors, auditors, and even journalists from state publications, though, in reality, many were intelligence operatives testing loyalty undercover. The first direct threat came unexpectedly. Petrov was in the kitchen preparing tea when a stranger appeared at the door. He was thin, tall, dressed in a gray overcoat, with a hat pulled low over his eyes. No introduction, no explanation, just a question, quietly but firmly delivered. Where is the master of the house? Petrov froze, aware that even a second's hesitation could betray him. The master, Volkov, was upstairs in his study, reviewing reports that, if seen, could compromise months of careful observation. Petrov answered calmly, guiding the man to the sitting room under the pretense of waiting for Volkov. Every step, every word was measured. Inside, Petrov's mind raced. Who was this man? State inspector? Foreign agent? An operative of the very government he was now indirectly serving? The visitor lingered longer than expected, scrutinizing the room, the furniture, even the positioning of books on shelves. Petrov noted small details, the tilt of the lamp, the faint scuff on the carpet, the patterns of light and shadow. He realized that surveillance was now being turned on him. If he faltered, if he reacted unnaturally, his value as an observer could vanish, or worse, invite suspicion. By the evening, the man left without incident, but the message was clear. The stakes had increased. Petrov's presence in the house was no longer merely an asset. It had become a potential liability. The silent tension he had carried for months now evolved into vigilance under scrutiny. That week, the agency pressed for a new kind of intelligence. The focus was no longer casual observation, but predictive analysis. Anticipate behavior, foresee conflicts, and report potential vulnerabilities before they became operational threats. This was a subtle shift, but critical. Petrov realized that the next mistake could be catastrophic. The turning point came during a dinner with Volkov and visiting officers from Leningrad. Petrov's task was ostensibly simple: serve food, clear dishes, ensure comfort. But he knew better. Every sentence, every gesture was a puzzle piece. Conversations flowed from mundane updates on supply lines to veiled references to foreign interference. Officers laughed politely at jokes that carried hidden critiques. Volkov responded with calculated nods, careful phrasing, and attention that tightened Petrov's chest. During this dinner, a small incident occurred. A spilled glass of water, a tray misaligned, a subtle curse muttered under breath by a visiting officer. Petrov seized it instantly, not as a failure, but as information. Who reacted, and how, revealed loyalties, stress points, and hierarchy. By the end of the evening, he had cataloged multiple indicators, alliances, disagreements, and undercurrents that were invisible to casual observers. Yet, with success came danger. Petrov noticed a pattern forming. Someone in the household, or nearby, was monitoring him. Small signs, a coat left slightly ajar, a shadow outside a window, a reflection in polished silverware. He adapted. Mental notes replaced written ones. Timing became crucial. Only record when unobserved. Only note when safe. The cognitive load was immense but necessary. The month continued with escalating pressure. Volkov's communication with Moscow became more urgent, more coded. Petrov intercepted fragments of conversations, noting the shift in tone. Mentions of protocol breaches and security audits suggested that his employer's loyalty, or at least operational reliability, was under review. Petrov realized that any misstep could trigger investigations, interrogations, or worse. A particularly tense moment occurred on the 21st of May. Volkov was summoned for an unscheduled trip to the capital. Orders were cryptic: leave immediately. Take only essential personnel. Petrov was included among those essential, though no explanation was offered. The journey by train was silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels and the occasional rustle of envelopes. The mind games continued. Were they testing endurance, awareness, loyalty, or merely moving pieces in a larger chessboard whose rules remained hidden? In the capital, Petrov's observational skills were pushed to their limits. Meetings with intelligence officers, logistical coordinators, and ministry officials demanded constant attention. Each face carried ambiguity. Was this an ally, a critic, a spy, or simply a bureaucrat with power? Conversations were layered in meaning. Phrases that seemed trivial could mask protocol breaches. Hesitation could indicate dissent. Petrov learned to weigh each word, each gesture, each pause. By the end of May, the consequences of exposure became real. A minor error by another staff member, a misplaced document, triggered immediate suspicion. Security protocols were tightened. Surveillance cameras, rarely seen before, were now active in hallways and stairwells. Petrov was reminded daily that the world he operated in was both invisible and unforgiving. In quiet moments, he reflected, months of careful observation had brought insight, but also isolation. Trust was impossible. Even those who seemed friendly, Volkov's wife, long-serving staff, were actors in a larger theater. Every smile, every gesture, every casual remark was part of a performance he could not fully read. Despite these pressures, Petrov's work yielded tangible results. Reports, reconstructed from memory, provided Moscow with an unparalleled view of Volkov's operational patterns. Analysts praised the clarity and accuracy of his observations. Yet recognition was distant. The agency maintained distance, reminding him that value was measured not by praise, but by continued performance. The month closed with a sobering realization. The shadow that had followed him for months was now indistinguishable from the household itself. Observation had become survival. Memory had become weaponized. And in this web of loyalty, secrecy, and subtle danger, Petrov understood that one false step could undo everything. June 1968 began with the oppressive heat of a city under quiet tension. The sun cast long, distorted shadows through the narrow streets, and the people below moved as if in slow motion, burdened by the invisible hand of fear and suspicion that lingered over every decision. For Ivan Petrov, the summer was no relief. It was a crucible. Each day offered new challenges, new threats, and new lessons in survival. The first sign that danger was closing in came in the form of a letter, slipped under the door of his quarters in the middle of the night. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but inside was a single sentence. Observe carefully. One error will not be forgiven. No signature, no seal, just the quiet weight of implication. Petrov understood immediately. Someone, Moscow, Volkov, or an unknown party, was watching him. His every movement, every action, every thought could be scrutinized, judged, and used against him. That morning, as he prepared for his daily tasks, Petrov reviewed the layout of the household. He noted small changes. The angle of a curtain, a chair moved slightly from its usual position, a book that had been shifted on a shelf. Each detail, seemingly insignificant, carried meaning. Someone was probing. Someone was testing. The question was, why? Petrov's instincts, honed over months of careful observation, told him to act with caution. Yet, he could not freeze completely. He moved through his day with deliberate calm, serving meals, clearing dishes, and maintaining the illusion of routine. But every interaction now carried an edge of danger. The close call came in the form of an unexpected visitor. A young officer, unfamiliar and brisk, arrived at the household under the pretense of delivering urgent orders from Moscow. He carried a leather briefcase, his eyes sharp and assessing. Petrov was tasked with escorting him to Volkov, an assignment that could have seemed mundane under normal circumstances. Here, however, it was a test. As Petrov guided the officer through the hallways, he noted subtle indicators. The officer's eyes flicking toward corners, fingers tracing the edges of doors, a shadow moving just beyond the window. Petrov recognized the signs of surveillance, of counter-surveillance, of a game played in layers invisible to the untrained eye. The tension was almost unbearable. One misstep, a misplaced foot, a hesitant glance, a faint reaction, could betray him. Volkov received the officer in his study, a room filled with maps, reports, and carefully cataloged documents. The officer delivered his orders with curt efficiency and left as abruptly as he had arrived. Petrov's heart raced long after the encounter, aware that even the briefest interaction could carry consequences. The events of that week revealed another troubling development. Reports from Moscow suggested a shift in intelligence priorities. What had once been passive observation was now expected to evolve into predictive analysis. Petrov was no longer merely an observer. He was to anticipate threats, identify vulnerabilities, and provide actionable insights. The margin for error had shrunk to nearly zero. Petrov's work became more demanding. Each day required the collection of subtle cues, the tone of Volkov's voice, the hesitation of visiting officers, the placement of documents on the table. He began to maintain a mental catalog, mapping relationships, loyalties, and potential fault lines. His memory became a weapon, his attention a shield, but the psychological toll was immense. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by vivid recollections of small mistakes and imagined breaches. He dreamed of shadows in corridors, of unseen observers taking note of every action. Even in moments of rest, the house was not safe. Petrov realized that survival was not just physical, it was mental. The mind had become a battlefield, each thought potentially exposing him to danger. On the 14th of June, the true test arrived. A fire alarm sounded unexpectedly in the middle of the night. The staff scrambled. The household erupted into controlled chaos, and Petrov moved quickly, observing and recording every reaction. He noticed an officer acting unusually calm, another pausing too long, a third moving in a pattern inconsistent with protocol. By morning, he had mapped a network of behaviors, understanding the hierarchy and loyalty of everyone in the house. The incident, however, carried a hidden consequence. Moscow's attention intensified. Petrov sensed that the alarm had not been accidental. Someone had engineered it as a probe, a way to test reactions under stress. His own response, measured yet alert, had kept him safe, but the implication was clear. His every move was being scrutinized by forces beyond the household. By mid-June, Petrov was increasingly aware of personal danger. Small hints accumulated. Anonymous notes slipped under doors, unexplained shadows in windows, whispers of inspections that never materialized. He began to question the loyalty of even those closest to him. The household, once a place of structured routine, had become a labyrinth of suspicion and risk. Yet, Petrov's work produced tangible results. Reports reconstructed from memory, capturing nuances of behavior and operational patterns, were delivered to Moscow and praised for their precision. Analysts recognized the depth of insight, the clarity of observations. But the praise was never public. Recognition came silently, in cryptic affirmations and subtle nods. Petrov's value was measured not by acknowledgement, but by continued performance under pressure. As the month drew to a close, the stakes reached a new height. A meeting was scheduled between Volkov and senior officers from the capital. Petrov's role was critical: maintain oversight, anticipate shifts, and ensure that any vulnerability in the household's operations was documented. The tension was palpable, the potential for exposure immense. Every gesture, every word, every pause mattered. In quiet reflection, Petrov understood a harsh truth. He was no longer simply observing. He was navigating a world where every human interaction carried risk, where loyalty and betrayal coexisted in a fragile balance, and where survival demanded constant vigilance. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a testing ground, a crucible in which every skill, every instinct, every thought was examined, judged, and weighed. July 1968 opened with an oppressive humidity that seemed to weigh on the city itself, as though the air had absorbed the tension swirling through its streets. For Ivan Petrov, the household was no longer simply a place of work. It was a minefield, each corridor a potential trap, each glance a test. Months of careful observation had sharpened his instincts to near superhuman precision, but even the most precise instincts could be deceived. The first sign that all was not as it seemed came subtly. A minor detail, almost invisible, a notebook left open on a desk, a page slightly folded. Petrov noted the handwriting, the pattern of underlines, the irregular spacing between words. It was deliberate. Someone wanted him to notice, to react, to be drawn into a path they had prepared. The agent in question was Maria Sokolova, a young clerk recently assigned to Volkov's household. Outwardly efficient and meticulous, Maria had earned the quiet respect of the staff. But Petrov, trained to read between lines and beneath appearances, noticed inconsistencies. Small gestures, her hand hesitating over documents, her gaze flicking toward corners she claimed not to see, triggered the alarms in his mind. Over the course of several days, Petrov began to document every interaction. The pattern emerged slowly but unmistakably. Maria was transmitting information outside the household. The method was subtle, almost invisible. Small marks in ledgers, coded placement of documents, brief conversations phrased as casual questions but carrying deeper meaning. Petrov understood immediately. This was betrayal at the highest level. Not just a lapse in loyalty, but a calculated act designed to expose vulnerabilities in Volkov's operations. The realization sent a chill through him. Betrayal was expected in intelligence work, but its closeness, the proximity of the threat, was a different danger entirely. One misstep, one overlooked signal, could compromise not only the household, but Moscow itself. The confrontation was impossible in the open. Petrov could not accuse, could not warn, could not act without evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. Instead, he adjusted his approach. Observation intensified, patience became a weapon, and every routine was adapted to allow surveillance without detection. He created mental maps of Maria's movements, noting patterns, timing, and subtle signals. Then, one evening, the situation escalated. Petrov observed Maria meeting with a man outside the household, in the narrow alley behind a local bakery. The man was unknown, his face obscured by shadows, but his posture, alert, cautious, and precise, marked him as professional. Notes, small slips of paper, passed between them. The exchange lasted mere minutes. Yet Petrov memorized details with painstaking clarity. The cadence of the man's steps, the angle of his approach, the subtle signals exchanged in a language invisible to the casual observer. Returning inside, Petrov cataloged every element. Each gesture, each movement, each nuance was recorded in his mind. He realized with grim certainty, Maria was not acting alone. This was part of a network, a chain of communication designed to undermine Volkov's household. The implications were severe. Any disruption in the network could trigger suspicion, compromise, and potentially lethal consequences for those involved. Over the following days, tension reached a breaking point. Petrov noticed other anomalies. Documents moved slightly from their usual positions. New staff members whose presence seemed unnecessary. Brief conversations ending abruptly when he entered a room. The threads of a larger conspiracy were revealing themselves, woven intricately and deliberately. On the 21st of July, the first open crisis occurred. A critical document containing operational intelligence and personnel details went missing for several hours. The household erupted in quiet panic. Volkov demanded immediate explanations. Officers scanned files, and the atmosphere became electric with suspicion. Petrov observed, measured, and cataloged, knowing that the missing document was a test, a probe, and perhaps the first overt move in a larger plan. By midnight, Petrov had reconstructed the chain of events. Maria had accessed the document under the guise of routine review, then removed it briefly to signal an external agent. The precision of her movements suggested prior experience, careful planning, and confidence that she would not be detected. Petrov understood the audacity of her actions and the danger of underestimating her. The next morning, he discreetly reported the anomalies to Volkov, framing the information as observations rather than accusations. Volkov, accustomed to subtle intelligence, listened carefully. Petrov's phrasing was deliberate, calculated, enough to alert, not enough to accuse prematurely. Volkov's reaction was measured, but the tension between the two was palpable. Trust was eroding, suspicion growing. Petrov's mental state frayed under the pressure. Sleep became fractured, haunted by imagined conversations, whispers in hallways, and the constant presence of eyes he could not see. Yet, even in this state, he could not falter. The survival of the household, the safety of key personnel, and the integrity of operations depended entirely on his clarity and precision. Then, an unexpected variable appeared. Another officer, Dmitry Ivanov, previously considered loyal, began acting strangely. He lingered near areas Petrov monitored, asked unusual questions, and, on one occasion, subtly attempted to access files without authorization. Petrov noted the behavior, recognizing the potential for a second layer of betrayal. The household was no longer a single point of concern. It had become a multifaceted web of suspicion. Petrov realized he had reached a critical decision point. Confrontation could expose him, delay could endanger operations, and inaction could allow the network to expand. The stakes were immense. Every choice carried weight. Every action could ripple through the fragile ecosystem of loyalty, deceit, and intelligence. By the end of July, Petrov had gathered enough evidence to establish patterns, confirm suspicions, and anticipate next moves. Maria's betrayal was undeniable, and Dmitri's potential complicity was clear. Yet, the operation required careful orchestration. Revealing a traitor too early could trigger defensive actions, while waiting too long risked exposure. Petrov's expertise, his patience, and his ability to read human behavior were now the critical factors in the survival of the household's mission. August arrived in Moscow with a gray, oppressive sky that seemed to mirror the tension within Volkov's household. Ivan Petrov moved through the rooms with the quiet precision of a man trained to observe everything while revealing nothing. The network he had uncovered, Maria's betrayal and Dmitri's suspicious behavior, was still active, still a threat. Every corridor, every file, every whispered conversation could be a trap. Petrov knew that patience alone would not suffice. The network had shown its boldness. Now it was time to act, but carefully. The first step was containment. He created invisible barriers around key information. Documents were reorganized, access restricted, and movements monitored more tightly than ever. Petrov's goal was simple: isolate the leak, observe the players, and prepare for a decisive move. Maria, as expected, did not remain idle. She continued her subtle signals, her coded messages, her casual questions layered with intent. Petrov traced every nuance, reconstructing the hidden paths of communication. One particular observation stood out: a briefcase, worn but meticulously maintained, that Maria handled differently from other items. The pattern suggested that the briefcase was a courier, temporarily holding sensitive documents before delivery. For 2 weeks, Petrov observed. Each day, he noted her movements with obsessive detail: the timing of her departure from the office, the angle she walked, the people she made eye contact with. Nothing was left to chance. Petrov's notes grew into a mental map, a blueprint of betrayal that was both elegant in its precision and terrifying in its implications. Then came the first direct test of Petrov's strategy. A scheduled meeting with Volkov was interrupted by a minor incident. A document went missing from the secure file cabinet. Officers searched frantically, voices tense but controlled. Petrov, standing silently to the side, knew exactly where it was and how it had been moved. This was no accident. It was a deliberate probe, testing his ability to respond. Petrov acted. In a series of discreet maneuvers, he subtly redirected staff attention, ensured the document's retrieval, and logged every interaction. By the end of the day, he had a complete record of movements, conversations, and gestures. The net was closing, but he had yet to reveal the trap he had meticulously prepared. Dmitri's role became clearer during these maneuvers. Unlike Maria, he did not appear to be a seasoned courier. Instead, he acted as an opportunist, exploiting gaps, testing limits, and subtly influencing perception. Petrov's awareness of Dmitri's motives allowed him to manipulate the officer without confrontation, a false sense of freedom, a carefully constructed illusion that he was operating undetected. The household's dynamics grew tense. Volkov noticed subtle shifts, documents missing briefly, staff distracted, minor errors accumulating, but could not pinpoint the source. Petrov's skill lay in maintaining calm, presenting evidence as observation rather than accusation, and ensuring the household functioned efficiently even under invisible threat. Then, a critical moment arrived. Maria attempted a high-risk transfer, a batch of intelligence documents hidden in plain sight within routine reports. Petrov anticipated the move, and the operation unfolded like a silent chess game. He observed, waited, and allowed the action to progress, all the while ensuring that Volkov's team remained unaware. At the precise moment, Petrov executed the containment strategy. The documents were secured, the courier path intercepted, and Maria's actions fully documented. The move was surgical, leaving no room for error. Petrov's preparation had allowed him to neutralize the immediate threat without alerting the network to suspicion. However, the situation was far from resolved. Maria's reaction was subtle but telling. Her posture stiffened, eyes flicked repeatedly toward Petrov, and small gestures betrayed her awareness. The network had not been destroyed, only delayed. Petrov recognized the danger. A cornered spy becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability in intelligence work can be lethal. Over the following days, Petrov monitored both Maria and Dmitry closely. Each interaction, each movement was cataloged and analyzed. Petrov identified patterns in Maria's communication, the time she preferred, and the method she employed. Dmitry's opportunistic actions became predictable, allowing Petrov to manipulate the environment, control access, and limit potential damage. Simultaneously, Petrov began crafting a strategy for final exposure. This required precision, timing, and psychological insight. He needed to draw Maria into a controlled situation, reveal her actions without triggering defensive measures, and ensure that any external agents she communicated with were left blind to the intervention. The turning point came unexpectedly. A neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar figure near the household's rear entrance, someone matching the profile of Maria's known contact. Petrov immediately launched a shadowing operation, following subtle trails, noting behaviors, and confirming the identity of the external agent. The discovery validated Petrov's suspicions. Maria was part of a larger network, and the threat extended beyond the immediate household. Petrov's next step was audacious. He designed a controlled scenario, presenting Maria with an opportunity to act, while ensuring surveillance captured every movement. The tension within the room was palpable. Each glance, each gesture, each decision held consequences. Petrov remained calm, a silent observer guiding the trap's outcome. Maria's choice confirmed the intelligence. She attempted to transmit information via her usual methods, unaware that Petrov had anticipated the move. The intercepted documents, the controlled environment, and the precise timing revealed not only her betrayal, but also the broader network structure. The results were immediate and profound. Volkov was presented with a complete dossier, detailing Maria's actions, her communications, and the external contacts she had maintained. Dmitry, while less experienced, was implicated in opportunistic breaches, providing critical insight into the network's internal dynamics. The household now possessed not only the evidence of betrayal, but also the knowledge to preempt future threats. By the end of August, the situation stabilized, but the lessons were clear. Trust, once fractured, could not be easily restored. The household operated under a renewed awareness of vulnerability, with Petrov as the silent guardian of security. The network's ambitions had been curtailed, but the shadow of espionage lingered, proof that vigilance, skill, and patience were essential for survival in the Cold War's intricate dance of deception. September settled over Moscow like a muted warning. The summer's gray clouds had lifted, but the tension inside Volkov's household remained palpable. The previous month's events, the interception of Maria's communications, Dmitry's opportunistic breaches, had reshaped the delicate equilibrium of trust. Petrov moved like a shadow through the rooms, observing without interference, cataloging every glance, every hesitation. The first task was interrogation. Maria was summoned under the guise of routine debriefing. Petrov had already gathered overwhelming evidence, but the objective was twofold: confirm the network structure and understand motivations. The approach required subtlety, psychological insight, and a careful balancing act. Aggression could provoke resistance. Leniency could encourage confession. Maria arrived, composed yet restrained. Her eyes betrayed the tension beneath the surface, a combination of defiance, fear, and calculation. Petrov opened the session not with accusations, but with observation, noting posture, micro-expressions, and breathing patterns. He allowed silence to fill the room, letting discomfort do what questions alone could not. "Your diligence is commendable," Petrov began, voice calm and measured. But diligence can serve two masters. Whose interests are you really protecting? Maria's lips tightened. She offered no immediate response. Petrov continued, layering the interrogation with subtle, psychological pressure. He referenced specific documents, movements, and intercepted communications. Each revelation was precise, surgical. Over hours, Maria's facade began to crack. She admitted to maintaining contact with external agents, framing it as a sense of duty, a misguided loyalty to an ideology she no longer fully understood. Yet her explanations were laced with omissions and contradictions, small but telling. Petrov noted them all. Meanwhile, Dmitri's interrogation followed a different path. Less experienced, less disciplined, he initially attempted deflection. Petrov allowed him space to speak, watching for inconsistencies. Dmitri's opportunism had been obvious from the start, but his confession provided unexpected insight. The network's methods, communication protocols, and contingency plans. While his role was minor, the intelligence gained was significant. The interrogations revealed a sobering truth. The household's vulnerability had been exploited not by a single individual, but by an interconnected web, stretching beyond immediate suspicion. Petrov's strategy of containment and observation had worked, but the implications extended far beyond Moscow's city limits. As the week progressed, Volkov reviewed the dossiers. He understood the delicate balance between justice and utility. Punishing Maria and Dmitri without consideration could alert other operatives, but leniency, without containment, could allow further breaches. The solution required precision, neutralization of the threat without destabilization of ongoing operations. Petrov devised a series of control measures. Maria was reassigned under surveillance, her communications monitored in real time. Dmitri was retained as a supervised operative, allowed limited access while providing insight into network behavior. These measures ensured operational continuity while minimizing risk, a strategy born from decades of experience in the shadows of espionage. Yet beyond the practical measures, the psychological impact was profound. Trust, once fractured, required meticulous reconstruction. Staff became hypervigilant, conversations measured, movements deliberate. The household operated with a new rhythm, one defined by caution, observation, and constant awareness of unseen eyes. In a broader intelligence context, the fallout extended further. Petrov's findings revealed systemic weaknesses, gaps in protocol, overlooked vulnerabilities, and underestimation of opportunistic actors like Dmitri. Recommendations were sent to higher authorities, prompting immediate audits and procedural reforms. The network's exposure had ripple effects, highlighting the fragility of security systems even in the most controlled environments. The human cost was equally evident. Maria, once confident in her dual loyalties, now faced isolation, constant monitoring, and the psychological strain of exposure. Dmitri, whose ambition had led him into dangerous territory, grappled with shame, fear, and the realization that opportunism alone could not substitute for discipline. Both became case studies in the subtle psychology of betrayal, how ideology, ambition, and human frailty intertwine in the shadowed corridors of espionage. Petrov, meanwhile, remained the unseen force orchestrating equilibrium. His satisfaction was measured, professional rather than personal. Every action had a purpose, every observation served a broader strategy. He recognized that intelligence work demanded both vigilance and restraint, understanding that victory in espionage was rarely absolute. It was a continuous negotiation between action and anticipation. The network's partial collapse prompted questions across Moscow's intelligence circles. Who else had been aware? Were other operatives compromised? How many had adapted, hidden, or fled? Petrov's dossier answered some questions, but many remained unresolved. A reminder that espionage thrives in uncertainty, exploiting ambiguity as its greatest weapon. By mid-September, the household had settled into a tense rhythm. Observation logs were meticulously updated, communications strictly regulated, and staff trained in enhanced counterintelligence practices. Petrov's influence was invisible but omnipresent, a constant, silent guardian shaping behavior and ensuring operational security. Volkov reflected on the lessons learned. Intelligence was not merely about gathering information. It was about understanding human nature, anticipating deception, and acting decisively without overreach. The balance between control and freedom, suspicion and trust, had been tested, and the household had survived. The final insight, perhaps the most sobering, concerned inevitability. In a world defined by covert operations, ideological conflict, and relentless ambition, betrayal was not an anomaly. It was a constant. Maria and Dmitri were examples, but not exceptions. Their actions illuminated broader truths. Networks are resilient, human motivations are complex, and even the most secure environment could be infiltrated. As September drew to a close, Petrov prepared for the next phase, consolidation. The network had been exposed, but the intelligence gathered required analysis, cross-referencing, and validation. The story was far from over. Reports would be sent, operations recalibrated, and new protocols implemented. Every detail mattered, for the cost of error was measured in compromised lives, lost information, and the erosion of trust. October settled over Moscow like a quiet, brittle veil. The city's streets, cloaked in the early chill, masked the tension that still lingered in Volkov's household. Days of observation, interrogation, and recalibration had left an invisible mark on every inhabitant. Trust had been fractured, loyalties questioned, and the shadow of betrayal remained. Yet, for the first time in months, the household functioned with a semblance of stability. Petrov moved among them as always, unseen, deliberate, analytical. The intelligence collected in the past weeks had been cataloged, verified, and cross-referenced. Maria and Dmitri were both under supervised observation, their behaviors logged with surgical precision. Their previous actions, once sources of anxiety and suspicion, had now become invaluable case studies in operational risk and human psychology. Maria, constrained but composed, had learned the harsh lesson that ideology alone could not shield her from scrutiny. Her defiance had given way to a cautious, almost resigned compliance. Petrov observed the subtle shifts, how she measured her words, how her movements carried the weight of accountability. Every decision, no matter how trivial, was now filtered through the lens of surveillance. Dmitri, on the other hand, displayed a mixture of guilt and pragmatism. His opportunism had nearly cost the network critical information, yet his confession provided insights that would shape future intelligence strategies. He had become a controlled asset, an example of how even minor operatives could yield disproportionate value when properly managed. The broader intelligence apparatus began to digest the implications. Reports circulated quietly through Moscow's channels, detailing the vulnerabilities, miscalculations, and overlooked opportunities that had been exposed. Petrov's recommendations were precise: enhanced verification of operatives, stricter communication protocols, and the implementation of behavioral analysis across all active networks. Yet even as protocols hardened, the human element remained unpredictable. Petrov understood that systems could fail, but human motivations, fear, ambition, loyalty, betrayal, were far more difficult to control. The revelation that a single misjudgment could compromise operations forced the agency to consider psychological profiling as seriously as technical surveillance. Outside the walls of Volkov's household, the world remained oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. Moscow carried on, the hum of daily life uninterrupted by the silent battles fought in corridors, living rooms, and across invisible communication lines. But within the walls of espionage, every lesson was learned at high cost, and every decision was scrutinized for its long-term implications. The final outcomes were complex, nuanced, and, in many ways, unresolved. Maria was reassigned to a monitored but operational role, her potential as an asset preserved, yet her freedom curtailed. Dmitri remained under supervision, contributing to intelligence gathering while his autonomy was deliberately limited. Both had been transformed by the experience, their actions and consequences serving as living examples of the fragility and resilience of covert networks. Petrov's reflections were methodical, almost clinical. Intelligence work was not about heroism or recognition. It was about foresight, discipline, and an unflinching assessment of risk. Every network had weaknesses, every operative had vulnerabilities, and every success carried with it the weight of potential failure. The exposure of Maria and Dmitri's activities was not a triumph. It was a necessary reckoning, a reminder that even the most secure systems could be tested and, sometimes, breached. The psychological toll, however, could not be quantified in reports or logs. Within the household, silence carried meaning. Conversations were measured, glances scrutinized, and interactions filtered through the ever-present lens of suspicion. Fear, respect, and a cautious sense of self-preservation defined the new normal. The lessons learned were profound. Vigilance must be constant, loyalty must be verified, and the consequences of error were inescapable. Across the network, analysts reviewed the chain of events. How had small lapses evolved into significant threats? What overlooked cues had signaled impending exposure? How could human behavior be better predicted, controlled, or guided without eroding operational efficacy? These questions became central to ongoing reforms, ensuring that the mistakes revealed by Maria and Dmitri would inform practices for years to come. The story of exposure, interrogation, and containment had a broader resonance beyond the immediate household. It illustrated the paradox of espionage. Power is both ephemeral and enduring. Trust is essential yet fragile. And human behavior, complex, inconsistent, and sometimes irrational, is the ultimate variable in a system designed to control uncertainty. By late October, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Operations continued, monitored and adapted in real time. Yet the legacy of the incident persisted, quietly influencing every decision, every assignment, every strategy. Petrov's meticulous oversight ensured that lessons were codified, mistakes corrected, and vulnerabilities addressed. The household, once a microcosm of unobserved routine, had become a model for controlled vigilance. And yet, for those who had lived through the exposure, the questions lingered. Could loyalty ever be fully verified? Were there other agents lying dormant, unseen, within networks assumed secure? How much of human ambition could be predicted, contained, or redirected before it became a threat? These questions had no definitive answers, only careful monitoring, adaptive strategy, and the understanding that espionage is an endless negotiation between knowledge and uncertainty. As the sun set over Moscow, casting long shadows across the streets, Petrov filed his final report. It was thorough, precise, and sober, an accounting not of triumph, but of understanding. The network had survived, albeit altered. The individuals involved had been accounted for, analyzed, and managed. And the lessons, hard-earned and indelible, would guide future operations. The story closes not with fanfare or finality, but with reflection. In the shadowed corridors of Cold War espionage, every victory was measured, every risk calculated, and every human action observed. Betrayal was not an exception. It was inevitable. And those who understood that truth, who acted with precision and restraint, were the ones who navigated the murky terrain of secrets and deception with survival intact. Questions for reflection, for those watching the story unfold. How do we balance trust and vigilance in environments defined by secrecy? Can human behavior ever be fully predicted in high-stakes situations? What lessons do past espionage failures teach us about the nature of power and deception? And finally, for viewers, if you found yourself in Volkov's position, would you act differently? Would you spot the warning signs sooner, trust differently, or recognize the human cost before it was too late? The Cold War was over decades ago, but its lessons endure. The shadows, the calculated risks, the fragile network of loyalty and betrayal. They remain relevant in any world where secrecy and human ambition collide. And in those shadows, the story of Maria, Dmitri, and the silent observer Petrov reminds us that vigilance is eternal, and the price of misjudgment is invariably high.